I was on the kitchen floor, half buried under a blanket and a pile of baby toys, when the phone rang. Daniel, my husband, was on the couch with Clara asleep on his chest, her tiny fist curled against his t-shirt like she was clinging to a tiny, very warm island. The house smelled like boiled sage from the diffuser and the faint linoleum sweet smell of newborn, powder and milk, and that impossible softness you want to bottle and keep forever. I had a hand on Clara's back, feeling the rise and fall of her breath, and for a ridiculous second I thought that was what forever might feel like. A chest that rises and falls, and a tiny person who trusts you so completely it makes your ribs hurt. Margaret, Daniel's mother, had been a steady presence through the pregnancy and the birth. She drove the long way to our appointments, sat through every scan like she was watching a Shakespeare performance, and stood by when the rest of the world seemed thin and slippery under my feet. She'd been in the delivery room, offering quiet squeezes to my hand when contractions came. Her calls had felt like lifelines, the friendly constant at the other end of a line we could trust. So when Daniel answered and said, "She's good. She's napping on me," I smiled. I liked the sound of my daughter being described as content and heavy and perfectly placed. Margaret's voice had that particular combination of sugar and steel. "It's not good to let her sleep on you," she said, a small pinprick comment. I thought, okay, a little nag. I can roll with it. Daniel said, "Calm. There's nothing wrong with it. We like it." "Don't build bad habits with my baby," she said. That one lodged under my ribs like an icicle. The possessive, my baby, was the part that made my stomach do a slow, unpleasant loop. I had no intention of being dramatic about it in the moment. Instead, I said, probably too lightly, "You can't build habits with a newborn." I heard her, through the line, do that little laugh that's a bridge between condescension and confidence. "Yes, you can. I've raised 3 children." There was a beat where the apartment seemed to hold its breath with me. I matched her tone because sarcasm is a useful, immediate defense. "Actually, no, you can't. It's science." She hung up. The click felt tiny and final, but the residue of it spread through me. Irritation, a curious flare of defensiveness, and that surprising animal heat of being protected. It wasn't just about a nap. It was about being a new mother and feeling both ferociously certain and pathetically unsure, and about Margaret's words sliding into the small cracks of that insecurity and setting up house. I watched Daniel shift on the couch, felt Clara murmur in her sleep, and tried to parse what exactly it was that had stung. Margaret's tone could be prickly, sure, but she'd been our island. I told myself that maybe she'd been having a bad day, or that my nerves were still raw from birth and sleep deprivation was turning everything into a personal slight. Still, I found myself replaying the phrase, "Don't build bad habits with my baby," and hearing underneath it a bunch of sharper implications. That I was inexperienced, that my instincts were negotiable, that my role as Clara's mother could be lectured to like a class. I felt ridiculous for caring so much about an offhand comment in a phone call. I also felt something else, a small, resolute heat. If Margaret thought she could own an intimacy with my child through tone and pronouns, she hadn't quite met me yet. Daniel sat up and looked at me, sleepy, puzzled. "Everything okay?" he asked. I touched Clara's head and felt the fine fuzz under my palm. "She's perfect," I said, "and she can nap on whoever she wants." Read Margaret's message at 2:17 a.m., which is a time when everything feels both smaller and gigantesque. The apartment is a little planet. Clara's heartbeat is the single ruling law of physics, and words on a screen glow like tiny edicts. The message was one of those epics people send when they want their feelings to have an arc. Paragraph breaks for emphasis, strategic italics in places where there was no italics feature. A handful of sentences that felt like they were waiting for music to swell underneath them. She started gentle. "I hope you and Clara are doing well. I think about you all the time." That part was warm, the sort of thing that made my eyes sting in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Then it folded inward into confession. "I've never been able to tell how you feel about me. I hope one day we can be close like I always imagined." My immediate reaction was bafflement. I'd been inside her kitchen, in her car, at her bedside at 3 a.m. She'd been at the hospital. Close didn't feel like a future aspiration. It felt like an existing fact. But there was more. The center of the letter was a slow, steady shove. I feel like you don't want to hear anything I have to say when it comes to the baby. I want to be able to give advice and make suggestions. I only want what's best for Clara. There were little examples thrown in. References to a couple of suggestions she'd made recently, which I'd said we wouldn't be doing, and that earlier phone comment about naps that had lodged itself under my skin like a splinter. I read it once, then again. The apartment was a hush of refrigerator and baby breath. I remember glancing down at Clara, all sleep-smushed lips and a snotty little trail at her nose that made me laugh silently with the kind of ridiculous love that borders on pain. I felt exposed in the way new parents do, like someone had placed a mirror on the nursery wall showing every small mistake I'd already made and every future one I might yet make. I started a reply and deleted it 3 times. I could feel my postpartum brain doing its faithful wobbly thing, hormones like a marching band. But under that drumline, there was a quieter, very practical logic. I didn't want to be dismissive, but I also didn't want to fold. I typed slowly, choosing words like stepping on floorboards so they wouldn't creak. I told her I was surprised by the message because, from my side of the table, we'd been close. Closer than I often am with my own siblings. I apologized for any times I might have seemed unwelcoming. That was true and also easy. I meant it. Then I drew my line as gently as I could. I don't want to invalidate what worked for you, but I also need to do what I've researched and what works for Clara. I appreciate your experience, but I don't want unsolicited advice unless I ask for it. If I need guidance, I will come to you. I want you to be a huge part of her life. I clicked send and felt like I had let a paper boat go down a river. It sank in the way conversation sometimes sinks when everyone's trying to be kind. Her reply was faster than I expected, and the tone had the tightness of someone stung. So, you're invalidating my experience as a mother. I'm sad you're so closed off. That phrase, invalidating my experience, sat there like a formal accusation. It was precise enough to sting. It implied, without saying it outright, that I'd been deliberately dismissive. For the rest of that night, I went through the mental Rolodex of our interactions, searching for any offhanded lines where I might have sounded chilly. Had I rolled my eyes when she suggested we swaddle the baby upside down? Had I been brusque about the herbal remedy she swore by? I could find little moments that might look that way out of context, but none that felt like the deliberate rejection she described. Daniel watched the thread unfurl like a man observing tectonic plates. He's not the type to like drama. He likes things steady and mapped, which is probably why he's such a good counterbalance to the wild cartography of new parenthood. He read my responses and then said a sentence that felt like a well-timed hand. You've stood your ground. Trust me. He left for Margaret's house right after, which is when my imagination did what it always does, went to the worst possible meeting of 2 forces and set it to music. I paced, I made tea that I forgot to drink, and I checked the baby monitor 57 times. When they returned a while later, Daniel first, then Margaret, I braced for an apology that would be thin and shiny, like tinsel used to cover a problem. Instead, Margaret's face had something softer in it, like the weather after a storm. She sat down on the armchair across from me and didn't launch immediately into defense. She was deliberate, the way someone who'd spent a lifetime building things thinks before they speak. The conversation that followed stretched and folded back on itself, like a recipe. Margaret talked about how in her day there weren't whole libraries of parenting studies at your fingertips. Advice was passed in kitchens, at church potlucks, over backyard fences. It was practical and oral and communal. We did what our mothers did, she said, and there was a nostalgia in that which wasn't mean. She admitted she'd assumed the same pattern would hold, that she would watch and instruct, and that her hands would keep guiding. She confessed that when things changed, when I read journals and watched lectures and made decisions that didn't line up with the practices she grew up with, she felt a kind of displacement, as if she were standing on the shoreline while a thinner, classier tide rearranged the sand. I told her about the research I'd done, small studies I'd read, articles that helped me pick between 2 types of bottles, the pediatrician's advice we followed about sleep positions, and I tried clumsily not to sound like I was knitting a banner of superiority. I wanted her to know that this felt like stewardship to me, not a rejection of her. I said plain, I want you here. I don't want orders. She listened, really listened, the kind of listening that unthreads defensiveness and leaves you with cloth. At one point, she reached across the coffee table and brushed Clara's foot with her knuckle, like an old habit, and then she said, almost like an afterthought, I'm sorry I was pushy. You're so soon postpartum. You didn't need that. And maybe you're doing a better job than I did. The last part was small and astonishing. It was both an apology and an abdication, a white flag that also folded into admiration. It wasn't gloating. It was a vulnerable, genuine thing. I felt something inside me unclench. Daniel slid into the conversation with the diplomacy of someone who's learned to manage both his mother's mercies and his wife's boundaries. He said he trusted my process, that we were a team, and that part of being a team was respecting who had the final call on the daily logistics of our daughter's life. He reminded Margaret of nights she'd stayed with us in the hospital, of the way she'd held my hand through contractions, and he said it in a way that didn't shout triumph. It simply put facts on the table. The rest of the evening moved like a tide pulling away debris. Margaret asked questions. How we chose our pediatrician, why we were doing a certain sleep arrangement, whether she could come to the pediatrician's next checkup, and I answered. She didn't give advice. She asked to learn. That small shift changed the tenor of everything. Advice as a monologue became advice as a shared craft. We talked until the light over the kitchen sink pool was soft, and the baby made sleepy noises like a small engine dying. I showed Margaret a bookmark with pediatric articles I'd saved. She admitted there were things she wanted to read too, not because she thought I was right and she was wrong, but because she wanted to understand the landscape that shaped our choices. It felt absurdly like watching two maps overlay to form a better atlas. When they finally left, it was late and the hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old perfume. Margaret hugged me, and for a second, I felt the decades of our relationship like a living thing under her arms. I don't want to be the kind of grandmother who gives unsolicited rules, she said. I want to be the kind who is invited in. That line lodged itself in my heart like a small, sensible jewel. Later, while Clara fed and dozed and the apartment hummed its small domestic song, I felt the relief that isn't loud. There was no dramatic courtroom justice, no vindictive flourish. Instead, there was the slow, long kind of justice that comes from being able to speak, be heard, and still keep people you love close. I'd held my ground without slamming a door, and the people who mattered had adjusted their sails. That felt like a victory the size of a spoonful of mashed banana, quiet, ordinary, and unexpectedly sweet.